Her breath hitched on the humid night air, fingers brushing the lapel of his impossibly tailored suit. He was 41, a man of lethal secrets. She was a woman with nothing to lose. His eyes, dark and desperate, locked on hers as he whispered, "Don't kiss me, Benne. I will ruin you." The 41st floor of the gleaming obsidian tower felt less like an office and more like a mausoleum for living emotion. Ha-Joon sat behind a desk crafted from a single slab of black marble, the surface utterly bare. The air filtration system kept the space sterile, devoid of scent or sound. He wore control like a second skin, a three-piece suit cut so precisely it looked molded to his formidable frame. His dark hair was meticulously styled, his hands rested flat, palms down on the cool marble. Even the rhythm of his breathing was disciplined. Ha-Joon looked out over the sprawling neon grid of Seoul, a city he commanded, yet felt nothing for. He saw patterns, liabilities, and opportunities, but never beauty. His life was built on ensuring that nothing, especially a volatile emotion, could breach the walls he had spent 2 decades constructing. He was a man defined by what he refused to feel. Miles away, in a basement club smelling of stale beer, clove smoke, and something rich and electric, Benne was singing. She was 31, and the spotlight loved the polished mahogany of her skin and the effortless defiance in her eyes. Her voice, a low, honeyed alto, wasn't just singing jazz, it was carving out a sanctuary from the world's chaos. Control was a word that had no meaning in her life. She lived on hustle, passion, and the terrifying, constant edge of debt. The money she made tonight was already earmarked for a loan shark, the man who had her younger brother, Chul, by the throat. She closed her set with a final, soaring note, the sound thick with a longing she couldn't name. A longing for stability, for safety, for a place where she didn't have to fight to exist. Backstage, a grim text message arrived. "The terms have changed. You meet the owner tonight, 10 p.m. Don't be late." Benne crumpled the napkin in her hand. The owner. Ha-Joon. The man whose name was whispered in fear, and whose face she knew only from grainy newspaper photos. She had expected to deal with intermediaries, not the apex predator himself. Terror, sharp and cold, mixed with a familiar, burning resentment. She wouldn't be weak. She adjusted her dress, the black silk a defiant statement, and walked out of the club, leaving the warm chaos for the cold certainty of the tower. When the express elevator doors opened on the first floor, Ha-Joon was waiting in the hallway, violating his own rule against unnecessary visibility. His presence felt like a physical pressure. Their eyes met, hers defiant, his assessing. And in that charged silence, Benne knew she hadn't just walked into a negotiation. She had walked into a fire. Benne is walking into the lion's den to save her brother, but she's hiding her fear behind fierce defiance. What do you think is the biggest risk she's taking by refusing to show fear to a man like Ha-Joon? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The meeting room was Ha-Joon's inner sanctum, minimalist and terrifyingly quiet. Benne sat opposite him, the dark mahogany table separating them like a vast, cold ocean. She held herself stiffly, refusing to lean back into the plush leather chair. Ha-Joon didn't offer water, didn't smile, and wasted no time on pleasantries. He laid out the terms of her brother's debt. Astronomical interest, a 2-year repayment schedule, or Chul vanished. "I can pay the principal," Benne said, her voice steady despite the hammer in her chest. "But not this interest, it's usury." "It's the cost of foolishness," Ha-Joon countered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that rarely needed to rise to command attention. "Your brother knew the price." Benne slammed her hand on the table, a reckless, explosive sound in the tomb-like silence. "He's a kid. You target people you know can't fight back. You won't get a cent more than the principal. I'll fight you in every court." Ha-Joon leaned forward, a slow, predatory movement that silenced her instantly. He didn't look angry. He looked intrigued, a far more dangerous emotion. He reached across the table, not to threaten, but to simply lift her hand from the mahogany. His skin was warm, scarred, and impossibly rough against her knuckles. The contact was a shock, a profound violation of the sterile distance he maintained. "You have fire," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over her face, a look that stripped away the defiance and saw the raw fear underneath. "But fire, when controlled, is useful. Uncontrolled, it burns the house down." He stood, abruptly pulling her up with him. Benne didn't resist. paralyzed by the sheer electric force of his presence. He walked her backwards slowly until her spine met the cold glass wall overlooking the midnight city. The air thinned. The scent of his crisp cologne and something darker, leather, metal, power, enveloped her. This wasn't about the dead anymore. This was about control and the terrifying thrill of watching him deliberately lose it. His free hand cupped her jaw, his thumb gently tracing the curve of her lower lip, a gesture so tender and possessive it made her lungs seize. She could feel his heart hammering, not fast but heavy and urgent, against her own rapid beat. His face lowered, his eyes closing the last fraction of distance. He was going to kiss her. And Benne, who had promised herself she would never be weak, never succumb to a man's power, found her head tilting back, ready to drown in the recklessness. Then his eyes snapped open. The predator returned, raw fear replacing desire. He stopped, inches away, his voice breaking on the inhale. "Don't kiss me, Benne," he warned, the words a raw, guttural plea torn from his chest. "I am 41. You are 31. I will ruin you." He released her instantly, stepping back as if burned. Benne stood trembling against the glass, tasting the subtext of his power. He was terrified of her, or rather, the destruction she represented to his controlled life. Ha-Joon, a man who dictates life and death, suddenly stops and issues that desperate warning. What past trauma or internal rule do you think Ha-Joon is terrified of breaking by allowing himself to kiss Benne? Leave your theories on his hidden emotional core in the comments. The shock of the forbidden moment, his whispered plea and sudden retreat, left an unbearable silence in the room. Benne was the first to break it, not with fear, but with a renewed, icy defiance. "You're right," she said, smoothing the front of her dress, her voice dangerously calm. "This is a stupid idea. I'll find another way to repay the debt." Ha-Joon's cold mask was back in place, harder than ever. He walked back to his desk, the black marble surface reflecting his emptiness. "There is no other way, Benne. Your brother's folly requires immediate and absolute discretion. Your ability to negotiate has concluded." He picked up a contract, his movements economical. "The interest is non-negotiable. However, I am offering an alternative settlement. You will work directly for me for 1 year. Confidential assistant, translator. Everything you see, hear, and touch stays inside these walls. Your brother's debt is frozen, and his safety is guaranteed for the duration." Benne stared at him. This wasn't a job offer. It was a sentence of forced proximity, governed by his control. It was a clear attempt to manage the dangerous spark that had ignited between them, placing it under the rigorous discipline of his authority. "You want to keep me close, like a loaded gun you don't trust?" she observed, her eyes challenging him to deny it. He met her gaze, his own unreadable. "I want to manage the risk. You are a loose end. This makes you a controllable asset. You will be at my office daily. No personal questions, no deviation from the assigned tasks. And," he paused, his voice dropping to the low, resonant tone that brooked no argument, "you will make sure that Act 2 never happens again." Benne felt the tension tighten in her stomach. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to protect her freedom and her heart. But she thought of Chul, scared and in danger. Her defiance melted into grudging acceptance. "I agree," she said, her agreement loaded with subtext. "But understand this, Ha-Joon, I'm here for my brother. Your rules are your armor, not mine. I won't pretend you're not dangerous, and I won't pretend you didn't almost kiss me." He simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of her subtext with silence. He had secured his asset, but he had failed to extinguish the fire. The emotional resistance was now officially formalized as an employer-employee contract, binding them together in a cage of rules. The contract immediately thrust Benne into the deep end of Ha-Joon's world. She wasn't just filing papers, she was interpreting high-stakes negotiations, attending tense midnight meetings, and navigating the labyrinthine protocols of his criminal enterprise. The sheer danger of her new existence was a physical pressure, but her proximity to Ha-Joon was the true emotional hazard. For 3 weeks, they maintained the rigid facade demanded by Act 3. They communicated only in terse, loaded commands and responses. Ha-Joon treated her like a precise, expensive machine, noting her efficiency without ever acknowledging her humanity. Benne, in turn, was a professional fortress, observing the subtle contradictions in the man, the absolute loyalty he commanded from his inner circle, and the strange, almost melancholy solitude he carried even in a crowded room. The facade cracked on a rainy Tuesday. Ha-Joon was planning a major acquisition, and the sensitive documents needed to be reviewed at a remote, secured location away from the tower's surveillance threats. They were flown by helicopter to a minimalist cliffside villa overlooking the stormy ocean. Isolated with the sound of the rain and the relentless crashing waves their only witnesses, the emotional rules began to crumble. That night, Benne was working late when a sudden power surge plunged the villa into darkness. She gasped, not from fear of the dark, but from the sudden, total silence. A flashlight beam cut through the mob black. Ha-Joon stood in the doorway, shedding his suit jacket. The first time she'd seen him dressed for comfort in a plain black t-shirt that revealed the coiled strength beneath. He walked past her, checking the breakers with silent, practiced efficiency. "The generator is stabilizing," he stated, his voice flat. "Good," Benne replied, clutching her notes. "I hate the dark." "Darkness exposes liabilities," he agreed, but his statement was philosophical, not professional. He lit a single heavy candle, placing it between them. The flickering flame softened the harsh lines of his face, making him look less like a boss and more like a weary man. "You should sleep," he instructed. "I need to finish this translation," she countered. "I don't trust your timing." He sighed, a low, genuine sound of exhaustion. Instead of leaving, he pulled up a chair and began pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into small glasses. He offered one to her. "It will slow your mind," he said. "Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is relax." They sat together in the candlelight, the only sound the storm and the clink of ice. It was a shared vulnerability, a moment of profound, reluctant human connection that neither of them had anticipated. They didn't talk about work, or debt, or the kiss. They simply existed in the same fragile, quiet space, the boundaries of control eroding with every passing minute. The shared silence over the whiskey in the dark villa had shifted their dynamic from professional rigidity to strained awareness. The next morning, while Ha-Joon was on a secure call, Benne searched for a power adapter in the villa's study, a room Ha-Joon clearly used as a temporary office. Her fingers brushed against a worn, leather-bound volume tucked behind a stack of finance reports. A book of classical Korean poetry. She pulled it out. Pressed between 2 pages was a faded, delicate photograph. It showed Ha-Joon, visibly younger, perhaps in his mid-20s, smiling broadly, his arm around a young woman with a kind face, their hands resting on the head of a toddler girl with Ha-Joon's dark, serious eyes. The child wore a silver locket. The photo was a punch to Benne's core. She recognized the profound grief instantly. The picture wasn't just old, it was mourned. This was the source of his sterile control, the emotional wound he sealed off to become the boss. She felt a wave of compassion, instantly understanding that his fear of ruin wasn't selfish. It was a desperate, protective measure taken after an unimaginable loss. Ha-Joon walked in, freezing instantly. His eyes, usually unreadable, were filled with a flash of raw, exposed pain, quickly replaced by terrifying anger. "Put that down," he commanded, his voice deadly low. Benne placed the book back carefully. "She was beautiful," she whispered, looking him in the eye, refusing to flinch. "I'm sorry, Ha-Joon." Her refusal to react with fear disarmed him. He leaned against the doorframe, his posture radiating exhaustion. "Loss," he said, the word a rasp. "It is the only thing a man of power cannot control. When you lose everything you love because of who you are, you eliminate love." Benne nodded, a memory surfacing. "My father was a politician, honest but proud. He refused a bribe from a powerful family. They didn't target him. They targeted the honest men around him. My mother, my aunt, ruined their reputations, destroyed their livelihoods. When he died, everyone he knew vanished." "So you learned that power is a lie," Ha-Joon finished for her, stepping closer. "No," Benne corrected, her eyes glistening. "I learned that love is a liability if you don't choose the right kind. I learned that men with power always choose their kingdom over the woman." He looked at her, truly seeing the cynical, protective wall she'd built. The silence was thick with the weight of their shared, painful histories. They had both survived betrayal and loss by erecting separate castles of cynicism. But now those walls were collapsing inward. Ha-Joon reached out, not to touch, but to simply hover his hand near her shoulder, the proximity a promise of understanding. The revelation of their shared history, Benne's fear of the powerful abandoning her, and Ha-Joon's guilt over the loss of his family, stripped away the veneer of the contract. The following days in the cliffside villa became a fragile truce, governed not by rules, but by a quiet, burgeoning respect. Ha-Joon started changing in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. He brought Benne coffee without being asked, remembering the precise amount of cream. He caught himself smiling once when she translated a particularly awkward negotiation with a blend of professional clarity and subtle dry wit. He didn't apologize for the past, but he offered glimpses into his present. "My daughter, Ji-Yun," he murmured late one evening, staring at the stormy horizon. "She loved the sound of the ocean. My biggest regret wasn't losing my control, it was losing the simple ability to hear the sea with her." Benne slid her chair closer, crossing the professional boundary without seeking permission. "You still hear it," she said softly. "You just hear the roar of the power you built to protect yourself from feeling the silence." He turned to her, and the intensity in his eyes was no longer about authority. It was naked, terrified honesty. "The power is the only thing that kept me alive, and the power is the only thing that means I can never have this." He gestured between them, acknowledging the undeniable connection. "This is just a moment, Ha-Joon," Benne whispered, recognizing the lie she was telling herself. "It's safety in a dangerous place." He reached for her, his movement slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to retreat. His large, rough hand cupped the back of her neck, his thumb resting gently on her pulse point. This was the moment he had forbidden in Act 2. This time there was no warning, no desperate retraction. He kissed her. It wasn't the fierce, overwhelming kiss of desire she had anticipated, but one weighted with fragility and relief. It was a kiss of two survivors finally finding a moment of peace, tasting safety in each other's presence. The kiss was tentative, a question mark posed in the darkness, and Benne answered it with a quiet, overwhelming surrender. She let go of the rigid control she'd maintained since her father's death, accepting the terrifying truth. She was falling for the most dangerous man she had ever met, precisely because he was the only one who had shown her his true human ruin. When they pulled back, Ha-Joon rested his forehead against hers. "This is a complication," he admitted, his voice rough. "No," Benne breathed, a faint smile touching her lips. "This is real. And that makes it the most dangerous thing you've faced in 20 years. The fragile bond forged in the quiet villa was immediately tested upon their return to Seoul. Ha-Joon knew he had crossed an ethical, professional, and existential line. He started to make subtle structural changes, directing his inner circle, the Gwaeon, to transition certain high-risk assets, signaling a gradual departure from the core criminal network. He was preparing to choose Benne, but he needed time to neutralize the blowback. His rival, a calculating older boss named Gwang-soo, saw the weakness instantly. Gwang-soo didn't need to see the kiss. He only needed to see the way Ha-Joon lingered too, long near Benne's desk, the brief proprietary glance he gave her when he thought no one was watching. Gwang-soo recognized the classic fatal flaw, a liability of the heart. The setup occurred during a high-stakes, heavily guarded negotiation dinner with an overseas consortium, a meeting vital to Ha-Joon's legitimate business future, his attempt at an exit strategy. Benne was present as the translator. Mid-meal, Gwang-soo arrived uninvited, flanked by his men. He bypassed Ha-Joon and walked directly to Benne, stopping beside her chair. The room instantly froze, the silence absolute. "Ah, the songbird," Gwang-soo sneered, his voice oily. "Such a vibrant little thing to have caught the boss's eye. Does she sing for you, Ha-Joon, or does she just distract you when you should be watching your back?" He reached out and grabbed Benne's wrist, not roughly, but with chilling possessiveness. "She's a distraction, boss. A liability. And in our world, liabilities get erased." Ha-Joon's face was a mask of cold, terrifying fury. He knew that any display of personal attachment would confirm Gwang-soo's power and put Benne in immediate, lethal danger. He had to choose between protecting his future and saving Benne's life. Benne watched him, her heart in her throat, silently begging him to choose her, to shatter the facade and protect their truth. Ha-Joon looked at Gwang-soo, then at the international investors, and finally, with a gaze that held no light, no recognition, he looked at Benne. "Release her," Ha-Joon commanded, his voice ice. "She is nothing to me, a hired hand, an employee whose contract will be terminated tonight. She has no value beyond her translation services." Gwang-soo released Benne, a triumphant, ugly smile spreading across his face. "As you command, boss. Good call." Benne didn't move. Ha-Joon had just chosen his kingdom. The brutal, unforgiving words, "She is nothing to me," were not a protection. They were a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. She stood up, her eyes blazing with the devastation of a woman who had allowed herself to hope, only to be crushed by the power she always feared. She walked past Ha-Joon, not flinching, and vanished into the night. He made no move to stop her. He had saved her life, but he had utterly destroyed the love he had begun to claim. Benne didn't run far. She ran back to the one place that felt remotely like home, the jazz club. She didn't sing. Instead, she sat in the empty backstage dressing room, the air thick with the ghost of her own vibrant past, letting the devastation wash over her. Ha-Joon's cold denial, "She is nothing to me," had confirmed her deepest fear. When threatened, men of power always discard the woman they claim to love. She felt foolish, having allowed herself to believe that a man who ruled by control could ever choose vulnerability. She had exchanged one cage, debt, for another, emotional dependency, and ended up losing both her freedom and her heart. She stayed there for 3 days, refusing calls, surviving on bitter coffee, trying to figure out how to put her old life back together. Her fear had hardened into a resolve. She would find a way to pay the debt herself and never again rely on a man's promise of protection. She was going to choose herself, even if it meant choosing loneliness. Meanwhile, back in the Obsidian Tower, Ha-Joon was surrounded by the ash of his power. He sat in his sterile office, the silence no longer a sanctuary but a suffocating judgment. His lie had saved Benne's life from Gwang-soo, but the cost was absolute. He had driven away the only light that had pierced his 2 decades of darkness. He realized his power was useless, maybe even toxic, if it meant he couldn't have her. The internal war was swift and brutal. The boss, Ha-Joon, was battling the man, Ha-Joon. The boss dictated control, the man desired connection. The memory of Benne's face, not the anger but the pure, crushing disappointment, was the final execution order. He didn't send flowers or a message. He chose action. He called his most trusted lawyer and his most loyal Gweon captain. Over the next 24 hours, Ha-Joon began an irreversible process, dismantling his empire. He liquidated high-risk assets, transferred crucial properties, and, most tellingly, arranged for the immediate and absolute repayment of every debt owed by Benne's brother, Chul, transferring the documentation to a neutral, legitimate law firm. He was systematically clearing the board, choosing the unpredictable risk of a quiet, honest life with Benne over the guaranteed security of his throne. He looked at the empty black marble desk, no longer seeing a symbol of power, but a blank slate. He stripped off his tailored suit, exchanging it for plain, functional clothing. The armor was off. He had to go to her, not as the Mafia Boss, but as the man who was finally choosing to lose control. 3 months later, Benne was back on stage, singing. It wasn't the basement club. It was a small, legitimate venue she'd leased using the unexpected, anonymous funds, the exact amount of the principal that had mysteriously appeared in her lawyer's account, along with the signed, notarized release of her brother's debt. She sang with a renewed rawness, her voice laced with the grief of having lost Ha-Joon, but also the fierce pride of knowing she had survived him. She finished her set, the applause a welcome shield against her solitude. She looked up and saw him. Ha-Joon stood by the back bar. He wasn't in his tailored armor. He wore a simple, dark sweater and worn leather jacket. He looked tired, older, and terrifyingly human. The sharp, controlled energy was gone, replaced by a quiet, vulnerable steadiness. He was a man who had intentionally given up his kingdom, and the loss was written in the lines around his eyes. He waited until the crowd dispersed. Benne walked toward him, her steps measured, her heart a frantic drummer. "Chul is safe," she stated, her voice trembling slightly. "The debt is gone. Thank you, Ha-Joon, now leave." "I am not here about the debt," he said, his voice low and devoid of command. "I am here about the lie. I said you were nothing to me because I knew Guangsu would kill anything I admitted was everything. I chose your life over my pride. But I chose my kingdom over you, and I deserve your hatred for that. He stepped closer, reaching into his jacket. Benne flinched, expecting a weapon, but he only pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, a cancelled flight ticket to a quiet coastal town in Europe. I left the city a month ago. I dismantled the network. I walked away from everything I built, he confessed. I am not the boss anymore, Benne. I am just Ha-Joon. I am 41. I have nothing to offer but honesty and the terrifying knowledge that I cannot exist without you. Tears streamed down Benne's face, blurring the edges of the man who stood before her. She saw the man from Act 5, the one mourning his family, the one terrified of ruin. You gave up your life for me, she whispered, the raw magnitude of his choice crashing over her. I chose the only life worth having, he corrected. He reached for her, his movement slow, tender, echoing the moment in the high-rise office months ago. His hands cupped her face, just as they had then. This time, he didn't lower his head instantly. He waited, asking with his eyes. Please kiss me, Benne, he murmured, his voice a plea, not a warning. I am what you are, and I will never ruin you. She closed the final distance. The kiss was slow, deep, and heavy with the weight of commitment and the joy of unexpected salvation. It wasn't the kiss of forbidden desire, but the kiss of two survivors who had finally found home. Ha-Joon had lost his empire, but he had won her heart, proving that true power lies in choosing vulnerability over control. They walked out into the cool night air, Ha-Joon placing a possessive yet gentle hand on the small of her back. They had a new life to build, quiet and real, far from the shadows of the city. Ha-Joon had to lose his entire criminal empire to prove his commitment to Benne. What is the biggest personal sacrifice you've ever seen someone make for true love? And was it worth it? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more crazy, raw romance stories like this one.